We people who are darker than blue, don't let us hang around this town and let what others say come true. We're just good for nothing, they all figure. A boy should roll up shoulders gently.
Welcome, everyone, to Darker Than Blue. It is Friday, October 3rd, 2025, 5 p.m., and that means I am Jackie Lukman, hostess of Darker Than Blue. I'm so glad you are here with me today, because boy, do I have a lot to talk to you about that I have been trying so hard to get to for a while, but life being what it is and the empire collapsing the way it is, it's been kind of hard to get to this topic. But what happened in the past week has helped me get here finally, because there was so much uproar and outrage, my friends, over Jimmy Kimmel being taken off the air after he said some things that the MAGA Kirk acolytes did not like. And listen, it was an interesting week, because what happened when it was just merely announced that Jimmy Kimmel would be suspended was that people immediately started boycotting Disney and ABC so fiercely. And ABC is the network that Kimmel's show is on, and Disney is the parent company of ABC. Disney owns ABC, but Disney's market value dropped so much, between $4 and $6 billion with a B, in the week following Jimmy Kimmel's suspension. And that included 1.7 million Disney Plus, Hulu, and ESPN Plus paid subscriber cancellations due to the consumer backlash of the canceling of Jimmy Kimmel's show. Now, that enormous loss in subscribers, which of course translated into an enormous loss of money, prompted the powers that be over at Disney to quickly reverse course and reinstate Kimmel's show, which, listen, I admit, I don't watch Jimmy Kimmel because that's just not my kind of thing. I'm not into late night TV, never have been. And anyway, 10 o'clock is pretty much my bedtime, me being, a beyond middle-aged lady and all that kind of stuff, and needing my beauty sleep. So I don't know what Jimmy Kimmel actually said, and I don't know what he said since then. But for the millions who canceled their subscriptions, they're the ones who forced this about face. And it was also a big deal for Disney's shareholders, who started legal action against the company, or at least threatened to start legal action against the company over the suspension. Robert Kaplan, the attorney who won sexual abuse and defamation cases against Donald Trump, is one of the lead attorneys for Disney investors, some of the biggest Disney investors, the American Federation of Teachers, the AFL-CIO, and Reporters Without Borders. Well, Kaplan, on behalf of his clients, issued a letter to Disney CEO Bob Iger last week demanding transparency into why they decided to yank Kimmel's show, and whether that decision was made because of political pressure from the Trump administration or not. And the letter basically said if Disney and ABC doesn't provide the documentation they requested to show why this decision was made to cancel or suspend Kimmel's show. And if they cannot prove that this decision was not politically motivated to censor free speech, or if they just didn't produce the documentation, actual legal action would follow. Now, I don't know where this threat is this week, but it is important to note that yes, an attorney actually did issue Disney a letter demanding prove that this was not the silencing of political speech that is supposed to be unconstitutional. And to make the point, Kaplan said in this letter, quote, "A bedrock of the United States and the key to our survival as the world's oldest democracy," I know that's arguable, but this is what he said, "is freedom of speech. The government cannot and should not threaten to punish someone simply because it does not like what they have to say. And while large media companies have been at the front lines, they too should not succumb to unconstitutional threats or blackmail." ABC was the network to run the series Schoolhouse Rock more than 50 years ago. Its leadership should pay attention to the important lessons it taught, particularly in the episodes The Preamble and No More Kings, end quote. That's a direct quote from the letter that attorney Robert Kaplan sent to ABC Disney demanding documentation proving that they did not decide to suspend Kimmel because of political pressure. And listen, y'all, this is all fine and good. And I'm actually glad it's happened. And I'm certainly interested to see how it's going to play out. But I say this whole thing is odd, and it is odd to me for a few reasons. First, let's talk about boycotts really quickly. We've talked about boycotts before, and there are opinions all over the spectrum about recent ones like the Target boycott over the company ending its DEI programs and what the demand is of that boycott, which is still, to me, not entirely clear. Because if reinstating those DEI programs is the goal, then we have to talk about how successful or impactful or beneficial the programs were in the first place for Black workers. We see how Target has lost money for sure, to the point that they've appointed a new CEO. But how has that impacted target workers' material conditions, right? That's a conversation that we need to have. And then there are those other like dubious social media calls for boycotts and blackouts that can't be traced to any organized effort or even a person who started it, that usually lead nowhere, so they don't accomplish anything, right? But there has been an active, an ongoing demand from Palestinians to engage with the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, BDS, for decades, for about 20 years to be precise. There's an entire organized effort that you can find information on at bdsmovement.net, exactly how it's spelled, to hold companies like Coca-Cola, KFC, McDonald's, Hewlett-Packard, and more accountable for their connection to the apartheid genocidal state of Israel. And again, this BDS campaign has been going on for 20 years. So how much attention have people paid to it? We know how much, at least in this country, not a lot. Because the companies on that list, the ones that I named that we are all familiar with, still enjoy very healthy sales in the US. The swift response to Disney's swift censorship of Kimmel was also odd to me, because people were so outraged by this one act of, it was blatant censorship, right? We know that millions canceled their subscriptions to Disney streaming services for that. But they ignored, like I said, the demands to boycott Disney since 2023 over their ties to pro-Zionist, anti-Palestinian content, particularly in Marvel movies. Yes, that demand to boycott Disney came from Palestinians in 2023. And that many people really believe that the Trump regime is the beginning of this campaign of censorship and political speech, and it's not. You know what I always say, friends? We think that we're experiencing something new now, but sadly, it's not. Because censorship of political speech in the US goes back to, man, 1798, to the Alien and Sedition Acts and the Espionage and Sedition Acts of World War I. These acts were passed during times of national stress. I mean, war is stressful, okay, but they were used to silence dissent and suppress criticism of the government. Let's take the Sedition Act, for instance. This made it a crime to publish false, scandalous, and malicious writing, that's directly from the legislation, against the government, Congress, or the president. The act was used to arrest and convict numerous Democrat Republican newspaper editors and printers who criticized Federalist policies, and that's where this legislation came from. Public backlash contributed to John Adams's defeat in the 1800 election. He lost that election because this act was passed and free speech was suppressed. When Thomas Jefferson took office, he pardoned the people who were convicted under that act and allowed it to expire. Then there were the Espionage and Sedition Acts. I mean, because when you let one sedition act expire, how are you going to suppress speech if you don't pass another one? And that's what was done in this country. The Espionage and Sedition Acts of World War I were passed under President Woodrow Wilson. That ought not be a surprise, that were designed to suppress dissent related to the war effort and were used against socialists, pacifists, and other anti-war activists. The Espionage Act of 1917 specifically prohibited interfering with military recruitment, promoting insubordination, or conveying information that could harm the U.S. armed forces. I don't know how you can actually do that, but that's what they said. It also granted the Postmaster General the power to censor mail deemed, quote, treasonable or anarchistic, end quote. Then the Sedition Act of 1918 was an amendment to the Espionage Act that expanded the law. It wasn't repressive enough. Expanded the law to outlaw, quote, disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language, end quote, about the U.S. government, flag, or military. Thousands of people were prosecuted and convicted under these laws for their written or verbal opposition to World War I. Socialist presidential candidate Eugene Debs was sentenced to 10 years in prison for a speech in which he condemned the Espionage Act. And this is when he ran for president while in prison, and he still got millions of votes. The Supreme Court initially upheld the convictions under these acts, but later, decades later, saw a shift toward stronger free speech protections. So the Sedition Act of 1918 was repealed in 1920. Then, if you thought it was over, it was not. Then there was the Smith Act just 20 years later in 1940. This law made it a crime to advocate or teach the violent overthrow of the government or to join a group with that goal. It was alleged to have been enacted to combat the evil anti-US propaganda from fascist and communist groups. You see, they have been conflating fascism and communism together for a long time. It's not new, but it was primarily used to prosecute Communist Party members, Socialist Worker Party members, and general socialists and anti-war activists. Fascists are never going to prosecute themselves and their friends, understand. The Supreme Court later reined in the act's reach in cases like Yates v. United States in 1957 and Bradenburg versus Ohio in 1969, setting a higher bar for conviction by requiring the speech to incite imminent lawless action. But y'all, we've seen how the Supreme Court, well, isn't supreme at defending our alleged rights. And no, that legislation is still there. It hasn't gone anywhere, y'all. But you can learn a lot more about the history of these particular laws used to censor Black leftists in particular in Dr. Sharice Burden Stelly's book, Red Scare, Black Scare, Theorizing Capitalist Racism in the United States, published by University of Chicago Press. Now, in that book, Dr. Burden Stelly talks about how the Black Scare was a state-sanctioned panic rooted in white fear of Black liberation that was combined with the anti-communist Red Scare sentiment in the U.S., that led to widespread surveillance and censorship of Black leftists. And her book explains how Black anti-capitalists and anti-imperialists were portrayed as, quote, foreign, alien, and undesirable to discredit their calls for Black self-determination. Check that book out. It is extremely important in understanding the ways that, say, the NAACP, for example, was compelled to purge its membership of suspected communists to avoid being red baited by the government. The congressional and government investigations, like the House Un-American Activities Committee, where prominent Black figures were investigated and blacklisted, including Paul Robeson, W.E.B. Du Bois, Charlotta Bass, Langston Hughes, Harry Belafonte. Black activists who refused to separate themselves from left movements were deported and imprisoned. And this included militant Black union workers who were pushed out of leadership positions or the unions altogether. And then there was the media and cultural blacklisting, where Black writers, artists, entertainers were blacklisted and silenced. Careers were destroyed after being labeled communists. That happened to Langston Hughes, who was disinvited from speaking at a college after being labeled subversive by red baiters. All right. So this censorship of particularly leftists and Black leftists that we're seeing today, it's not new. It's not. And it is absolutely connected to what we are seeing today, this history that Dr. Sharice Burden Stelly talks about in her book, where we see that states have banned teaching Black history and African American studies, wrongly labeling them critical race theory or wokeism. The censorship of Black Lives Matter in 2021. After the 2020 uprising, we see that the slogan and even clothing worn by people were banned in some school districts across this country in 2021, and the labeling and suppression of radical activism that we've seen from the McCarthy era transported into the modern era, that includes the labeling of Black activists as Black identity extremists, and of course using wokeism as a dirty word. And we see that expanded or escalated with the Trump administration now designating a non-organization, Antifa, a terrorist organization. To be clear, family, there is no organization called Antifa. Antifa is short for anti-fascist. Do not be fooled, however, into thinking that Trump and his henchmen do not know this. They do. They also know that their supporters will believe every lie they tell them. They know that their supporters do not know this and will believe there is a big, scary Antifa organization filled with Black BLM members and their gullible, guilt-ridden, woke white allies that are coming after their freedoms. Many of these people do not care about facts and reality. But some might be moved if they hear the truth, which is why we have to keep telling it. And a lot of our own people don't know the deep history of the repression of Black left organizing for self-determination in this country, which is also why we have to keep talking about this history. So it is important for us to know that this has not been what we see going on now is not the totality of censorship in this country. It didn't start here. The media has been subject to a form of bipartisan censorship that we've paid way too little attention to. And I'm not even talking about the laws that I just mentioned. I'm talking about just the last 40 years, which has produced the heavily censored media content we consume today. Now, this started in the modern era with the 1987 repeal of a law called the Fairness Doctrine. And that was followed by the 1996 Telecommunications Act. I've been threatening to talk about this for a minute, and here we are. These two actions, combined with ongoing deregulation, capitalists love deregulation. They do not like the government that they control to use to control us in every aspect of our lives. They don't like the same government putting any kind of regulations on them. Talk about hypocrisy. But anyway, the ongoing deregulation of the media landscape allowed media companies to consolidate ownership of broadcast outlets, reduce local content, and increase the amplification of partisan viewpoints. So let's start with the consequences of the repealing of the Fairness Doctrine in 1987. The FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, repealed that doctrine, which had been in place since 1949, and it was replaced during, guess who? The Reagan administration. Of course it was. This repeal of this doctrine resulted in the following consequences. It encouraged partisan media because it required with the Fairness Doctrine rather, when it was in place, required broadcasters to cover issues of public importance and present contrasting viewpoints of that issue or those issues. When the Fairness Doctrine was repealed, it removed the obligation to do that, to present all sides of any and every important issue. And that immediately opened the door for the rise of partisan talk radio. Rush Limbaugh, y'all, whose national show began in 1988, just 1 year after the Fairness Doctrine was repealed. The repeal of the Fairness Doctrine also reduced public affairs content. By no longer mandating the presentation of diverse perspectives, the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine enabled broadcasters to avoid covering controversial issues altogether. So if you are wondering why your favorite news station is not giving you any news about multiple genocides going on, well, I'm telling you why right now. This led to a significant decline in news and public affairs programming. And we see this today with exactly what I just said. The way the genocide in Gaza, the way the conflict in Congo, the way the genocide in Sudan is still not covered. The way the impending military intervention and the prelude to anher invasion of Haiti was just voted on and approved in the United Nations. You're not hearing any of that on most corporate media, certainly not local news outlets today. And only one view, if you do hear about it, only one view of what is reported is ever given. The corporate, capitalist, imperialist view. So in the case of Gaza in particular, what we're hearing is the Zionist view of what's happening in Gaza. The voice of Palestinians is never covered. And we see the same with domestic social issues covered from the perspective of law enforcement in the case of like victims of police abuse. who are presented as presumed guilty or as suspects in the media rather than citizens whose rights may have been violated by law enforcement. And we are only ever told the narrative of the police, even in cases where it is later proven that the police have lied or judicial misconduct arises. And this is why most Americans believe that Assata Shakur really did murder that New Jersey cop, despite her trial being rigged by racists throughout the system, from the cops themselves to the jury and the judge. Although investigations into her case clearly show racial bias against her in an unfair trial, U.S. media has never and will never mention this when talking about her, even when they mentioned her recent death. The repeal of the Fairness Doctrine also eroded local editorializing. Without the Fairness Doctrine, stations were no longer incentivized to produce local editorials. And this cut to this service, this aspect of media, which they did to reduce costs, actually avoided providing local content, but they did it also, they said, to avoid alienating advertisers. Advertiser money was more important than telling the truth from the perspective of the people who were most impacted by the news they were supposed to be covering. That's bad. That by law, U.S. media is no longer required to present fair, impartial, nonpartisan, non-discriminatory content. That's really awful, all by itself. But guess what? The repeal of the Fairness Doctrine is just one part of this problem, because the impact of the passage of the Telecommunications Act of 1996 drove the final nails into the coffin of real informative news coverage in this country. Now, that piece of legislation was passed by everyone's favorite Black president, William Jefferson. I used Black prison labor to work in the governor's mansion in Arkansas, and y'all voted for me anyway, Clinton, in 1996. While proponents of the legislation argued that the Telecommunications Act would foster competition and lower prices, the lie that capitalists always tell the people when they're about to rob us blind, the legislation actually had the opposite effect by relaxing media ownership restrictions. Deregulation. Sounds innocent enough, right? But it wasn't, because what it did was to spur massive radio consolidation. The act eliminated national ownership caps for radio stations. Yes, there used to be a time when one company couldn't own 180 radio stations. The 1996 Telecommunications Act did away with that. And that triggered a really swift wave of mergers and buyouts. And this allowed a few companies like iHeartRadio, formerly Clear Channel, to control hundreds of stations, resulting in reduced local programming, layoffs, and more uniform satellite-fed sound. This is why the music you listen to on the radio is garbage. Increased television consolidation also happened with the passage of this legislation, because it relaxed television ownership rules too, for the same reasons, increasing the percentage of the national audience a single company could reach. In the years that followed the passage of this legislation, the growth of powerful TV station groups exploded. And subsequent regulatory decisions by the FCC have just further enabled more consolidation in local markets. The legislation also accelerated cross-industry mergers, because the law removed barriers that were in place before between different telecommunications sectors, which led to massive vertically integrated media conglomerates like AOL and Time Warner that merged in 2000 and was one of the largest ever media mergers, which combined an internet service provider with a vast media empire, Comcast and NBC Universal in 2011, AT&T and the Time Warner Group in 2018. Yeah, all of that stuff. So these two pieces of legislations, my friend, are the reason the music you listen to on corporate radio stations, and if you think your local radio station is independent and local, it's not. Other than WPFW, friends, that's the beauty and the power of this station and the shows on it. We're not included in this because we are people powered. Your favorite local a major station, ABC, NBC, CBS, even CNN, MSNBC, even Fox News, all of your favorite local, you think they're local news outlets? Oh no, my friends. They are all owned by some media conglomerate thanks to these two pieces of legislation. But there is more of the fallout from these two pieces of legislation that we need to talk about that relate to what is going on right now. But you know what? It's almost 30 minutes. We are at 30 minutes past the hour, and you know it's time for a station break. So, engineer extraordinaire, what do we have on tap for the people today?
WPFW has offered inspiring music, poignant stories, and critical journalism for over 48 years. Whether reminiscing while hearing Nina Simone or learning about the harm done due to gross global inequity, WPFW has been the soundtrack for moments of revelation, joy, sadness, and resistance. It's your generosity that allows us to continue this tradition of expansive, emancipatory excellence in community radio. We ask you to once again be in solidarity with WPFW during our fall pledge drive by donating at WPFWFM.org, and additionally from October 12th through the 25th at 800-222-9739. There is only one WPFW and only one you, the listener, who is committed to keeping independent music and message available to the people. Your generosity sustains and challenges us to build a better world, one broadcast at a time.
Thank you so much. See, I told you. Dear friends, tomorrow is also the launch of the Black Alliance for Peace's 5th International Month of Action Against AFRICOM. This is a crucial period of global education, mobilization, and resistance, and this year's theme is 21st century neocolonialism, capitalism, compradors, and the ongoing scramble for Africa. There will be an international webinar from 1 o'clock to 4 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time to kick off the month, featuring voices from the African continent and diaspora, expressing the need for the complete withdrawal of U.S. troops and an end to the combatant command from the continent. Find information to register and to find locations for watch parties at blackallianceforpeace.com/AFRICOM 2025. That is blackallianceforpeace.com/AFRICOM, the numbers 2025. And on Saturday, also starting at noon, Plymouth Congregational United Church of Christ will hold its annual community festival at 5301 North Capitol Street Northwest. I will be speaking there around 1 o'clock or so, right before I run over to the AFRICOM watch party at the Southwest Library. Find more information about Plymouth Congregational United Church of Christ's Community Festival tomorrow on their Facebook page at facebook.com/Plymouth Church DC. That's PLYMOUTHCHURCHDC. All right. Let's get back to this combined effect on the media landscape of these two pieces of legislation, the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine and the passage of the Telecommunications Act of 1996. Because they created a media landscape dominated by a shrinking number of very, very powerful corporations. This has led to what we see now in media today: reduced diversity of voices, not a reduced diversity of people delivering the news, because yes, there are plenty of black and brown faces on these media outlets, but the perspective that you hear on all of them is basically the same, because it is a result of the powerful small number of owners of all of these media outlets. Because this media consolidation has limited the variety of perspectives available to the public, because the owners of these outlets limit what information they allow to be given to the public, right? That we see, that we know that's happening. And this has resulted in what? Increased political polarization, because the combination of partisan media and reduced coverage of all the things going on, particularly in local areas, and the lack of nuanced analysis and differing opinions on issues is a contributing factor to the increased polarization of people in the country. And then, of course, it also created this shift from public interest to profit. And actually, that's the reason it was done. With fewer regulations, the media industry is now prioritized to pursue profits over its role as a public trustee of fair and accurate information. And this has resulted in less actual public affairs programming, with fewer journalists and literally more talking heads and online personalities, news personalities, and declining minority ownership of any and all media outlets. So, why does this matter in the context of the current efforts in censorship? Because as we see in the very low level of understanding of basic reality among way too many people in this country, media consolidation is actually very, very dangerous. It concentrates the power to shape public opinion on everything into fewer and fewer hands. And a functioning democracy, and listen, I'm not sitting here arguing that this place is, because you know I have consistently argued that this country is not a democracy, but a functioning democracy, if this country were one, relies on a well-informed electorate that has access to a wide range of facts, perspectives, and investigative reporting. These two pieces of legislation have instead created a single point of information control. Because when a few massive corporations like Comcast, Disney, Paramount control through ownership and affiliation or outright ownership of hundreds of local TV stations, cable networks, film studios, and online platforms, they control the narrative. They choose which stories to cover, how to frame them, and which stories to ignore. It also creates the obvious suppression of dissent. Consolidation often leads to the homogenization of news. Controversial or complex stories that might offend the powerful owning interests, including the parent companies, other business ventures, or political allies, can be downplayed or just ignored entirely. And then there's the erosion of local journalism that these legislations and the media consolidation that they've created have produced. Giant corporations often buy local news outlets and then fire all the staff to maximize profit. And this, of course, leads to news deserts where communities have no original local reporting on city hall, school boards, or local corruption. This is why we don't know what's going on in the cities and the states across this country. A citizen who doesn't know what their local government is doing cannot hold it accountable. And that's how they want it. Then there's a lack of viewpoint diversity and the echo chamber effect. I get kind of annoyed, friends, when people online talk about, oh my God, Jackie, the content you create, it's just an echo chamber. I didn't create the echo chamber, honey. I didn't. Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton did, and their friends. I didn't create the echo chamber, because a robust marketplace of ideas, which is what is supposed to exist in a so-called democracy, requires competition between different viewpoints. Now, that's a real debate, not this mess that they claim Charlie Kirk was doing. But we now have a lack of diversity of viewpoints provided to the people on any and every issue. That is what creates an echo chamber. We don't realize that's what we're getting when we watch our favorite news programs on any and every channel. But what they're providing us, y'all, is not news. It's their approved opinions on what they want us to know. In this homogenized content that consolidated media produces serves the largest possible audience to maximize advertising revenue for the corporate bosses. And this squeezes out niche, alternative, and minority perspectives that are vital for a truly diverse and democratic culture. These people give us the illusion of choice. You might feel like you have hundreds of channels to choose from, and technically you do on all of these streaming services. But if they're all owned, all of the streaming services are all owned by the same 5 companies, then the underlying perspective and corporate interests are often aligned. So you're not choosing from all these hundreds of different perspectives. You're choosing from a menu, but the same chef is cooking all the food, and it's really the same dish. They just have different names. They've also created conflicts of interest, and they're fine with that. They don't care. A media conglomerate that also owns defense contractors, pharmaceutical companies, or entertainment parks, they all have a vested interest in how news about regulation, war, or consumer safety is reported. And this creates an inherent conflict that we all see, but I don't think we realize where it came from. This is why I had to do this show, because this is where the media bias comes from. This is why you didn't know you were being lied to about Iraq. This is why you didn't know you were being lied to about Afghanistan. This is why you don't know that you are being lied to about Gaza, and you have been lied to about IAT, and you've been lied to about AFRICOM, and you're not even being told anything about Congo and Sudan. So this means there's no cultural diversity in the media that we are provided. And this is obviously dangerous, because media does not just inform us, it also shapes our culture, shapes how we see our culture, how we see ourselves in our culture, and how we see other people in our culture, and tells us what is important to us and what's not. So instead of the voices and realities of different communities and people being presented to everyone, media consolidation has given us this standardized culture. Because consolidation favors things that it can count on for a profit, like blockbuster movies, formulaic TV shows, and same basic bland top 40 music that have proven mass appeal. This makes it a lot harder for independent, foreign language, or culturally specific art to find a platform in today's US media landscape. So now you know why you can't escape those damn blockbuster superhero movies that are formulaic and predictable. That's all they want you to consume, because they know they will make money off of it. Oh, and if you think that that's solved by social media podcasts that allegedly provide the range of opinions not presented in mainstream media, think again. because social media companies and their platforms are not immune to this. Think about Russiagate, y'all. Russiagate censorship was a real thing. Major social media companies took action to limit the spread of Russian disinformation during the Russiagate controversy. And I had a lot to say about that. And you're just going to have to go back and look at some other shows, but it's garbage. It was a lie. But they were incredibly aggressive. They, meaning the tech companies, were incredibly aggressive in silencing dissent during that period. These tech companies' moderation efforts, both during and after that period, because it's still going on, have impacted legitimate political speech, making it really hard for people to realize that they were indeed being lied to. Then there were removal of state-linked networks in the aftermath of the 2016 election, where platforms like Facebook, which is now called Meta, and Twitter, which is now called X, and I hate calling it that, removed networks of accounts that they claimed were inauthentic and pages that they identified as being tied to the Internet Research Agency, or Russia by default, which was accused of interfering in the election, but actually proven that they actually did not. The Internet Research Agency was trolling for clicks for sales. They did not propagate media or memes or information about the election at all. But what happened during that period and since then was the removal, the demonetization, and content reduction or complete removal on these platforms that they claimed was meant to prevent Russian state-controlled misinformation from spreading. But what they did was just silence a bunch of people. Platforms began to label posts and content from what they identified as Russian state-controlled media like a scarlet letter. And it resurfaced in 2020 after the Russian response to the US proxy war using Ukraine against Russia. More of that happened with outlets like RT and Sputnik were labeled as Russian state radio and eventually just taken off of these social media platforms. So then, because these platforms were removed from the mainstream social media outlets, the information about Russiagate being a lie was severely suppressed. And it just continued, and it continues to this day. So we're looking at right now a media landscape that it doesn't matter what kind of media you are looking for. It doesn't matter what kind of media you're trying to consume. You're not getting the news. You're not getting the actual real information about what is going on. You're certainly not getting information about a perspective other than what you're being told over and over again, the exact same script on every issue that is being reported on 15 different platforms. That's where we are now. And a little note about social media, because a lot of folks on the right will say that, the Biden administration lobbied the big tech companies to crack down on misinformation during the COVID pandemic and after January 6th. And that's true. That is absolutely true. The Biden administration did pressure the big tech social media companies to silence right-wing platforms. But make no mistake, friends, long before and outside of these high-profile political examples of COVID-19 and January 6th, where plenty of content was removed or censored in social media on the right, there has always been, and there is more of, the everyday censorship of non-white, non-right-wing content creators on what was supposed to be the new and egalitarian outlet for people's news. That's what social media was supposed to be. At least that's what they told us. Multiple reports have indicated that Black content creators, especially those of us with left-leaning perspectives, have always faced and continue to face disproportionate censorship, primarily through content moderation, shadow banning, and complete content removal compared to everybody else, particularly white people and specifically the right wing. Research suggests that this is caused by, well, we know what it's caused by, a combination of algorithmic bias, and algorithms are coded by human beings, inconsistent moderation, also carried out by human beings, and targeted harassment from other human beings on these platforms. So, for Black left leaning creators, this censorship of social media is magnified, and it always has been, because our content often directly engages with social justice issues and systemic inequality that the very people who own all of these outlets do not want to talk about, don't want to do anything about, and they don't want us telling people that they should. So, of course, this means our voices are silenced. The targeted removal of content that discusses racism and equity leads to isolation and discouragement among our people, hindering the ability of our people to voice our experiences and connect through that struggle and convey this struggle to other people. It creates financial harm for us because we rely on social media for our livelihood. More and more of us, or try to, but we can't with shadow banning and demonetization. Then, of course, there is the cultural erasure. Nobody wants to talk about our culture because, see, the people who are in control of these media outlets, all of them, are telling you that our culture is violence and laziness and entitlement seeking. That's the culture they want to convey to you. But when we try to convey our culture and the truths of our material realities, these same outlets, from corporate media news to corporate corporate-owned social media outlets, they suppress those voices because the algorithms and the moderation and the shadow banning constantly undermining our information, erasing our creative contributions, and attributing trends that they start to mainstream, which are always the white influencers. Anytime you see content that comes from a Black influencer on social media, 6.5 times out of 10, that content is some garbage. If it's for a Black content creator, or it is in support of the right-wing narrative of the owner of the platform. So, in the context of total corporate media consolidation, this means the loss of local identity, silencing voices, isolation of communities. And this is why, again, WPFW is so doggone important and vital to our survival, as is Black Liberation Media, Luke Mon Nation, Black Agenda Report, now a part of Sovereign Media. You better go check that out. That is amazing. And of course, all this was done for money, for the profit of a very, very few media moguls. Despite what politicians said back in 1996 about the 1996 Telecommunications Act fostering competition, which would lead to better and wider range of content and better prices for consumers, the exact opposite has happened. We got higher prices, we got less information, we got less variety. So what does this mean for us now? Well, we see what it means for us now. But specifically, why is this important? Everything I just told you to understanding today in light of what just happened with Disney and Jimmy Kimmel. Well, the best way to explain the connection between these things is the fact that the Sinclair Broadcasting Group owns or operates nearly 200 local TV stations across the US, and they famously forced their local stations to air centrally produced must-run segments, which often feature politically conservative commentary because the family that owns Sinclair Media are conservatives. They are conservative Republicans. They give lots of money to Republican candidates. They hire Republican strategists to create their content that they mandate is a broadcast over all their affiliates. They present this content, it's not information, under the banner of their trusted local news stations, undermining the very concept of local independent journalism. So, the conservative leaning influence of all of our media obviously presents us with a politically partisan stream of information, because all of the six corporations in this country own just about every single media outlet that exists. I don't care what the media outlet is. I don't care if it's a movie studio. I don't care if it's your local news, your ABC, CBS, NBC affiliate. I don't care if it's Facebook or Twitter. 6 media companies own most, over 90% of the media outlets in this country. And this is why so many people in this country know little about people who are not like them, who are not conservative, who are not white, who are not quote unquote middle class, who are not Trump supporters, who are not liberal, who are not neoliberal, who are not in support of war, who are not Zionists, who are not blindly pro-police, that they would overlook and ignore and even support rampant, violent, deadly police abuse. The repeal of the Fairness Doctrine in 1987 and the passage of the Telecommunications Act in 1996 are what created the media condition we have today. What Donald Trump is doing right now is not new. It has been U.S. policy to censor dissent against bloodthirsty imperialist U.S. warmongering since 1917. And the censorship of Jimmy Kimmel and everybody else who has tried to tell the truth about Charlie Kirk, even just repeating what he actually said, this is not a new phase of censorship. It's not new censorship. It is just the next phase of a long, long history of U.S. censorship of voices of dissent, not to Republicans and Democrats, but this bipartisan support of this media outlet, this media landscape we have, is designed to censor and crush dissent of the ruling class. That's why we're where we are. But I'm out of time for this show. Thank you so much for joining me. Please join me next week, where we will continue to tell the truth about what is going on in this country, because somebody's got to do it. You're not going to get it from your local news or social media, that's for sure. Thank you so much for joining me today. A luta continua, the struggle continues. But if we keep pursuing the truth, I promise you, Victoria Acerta, victory is certain. Peace.